This is SSN
Story Studio Network.
I'm Tom Hoppe, and I'm your host of the Most Painful Podcast. Before I start the show today, I just want to say thank you to our listening audience. Our show has grown. We're being heard both in Canada, the US, Europe, and other places in the world. And that's all due to your feedback to help us make this show better. I also want to highlight some of the programs that are coming on for the remaining of Season 2, which will end in May 2023. We're going to talk about safe movement. We know with chronic pain, safe movement is important, but how do we do it right? We're going to have Dr. Lindsay Wright on to talk about that. And also we're going to talk about yogic breathing. Breathing can help calm the nervous system. And we're going to have Dr. Abby Manu-Sood on to talk about yogic breathing. And also nutrition and pain. We know that food fuels the body, what food is good for pain, and what food causes pain. So we'll have those shows on. And also coming up, we're launching the French version of the Most Painful Podcast. And to finish off Season 2, I'm going to have the host of the French version of the Most Painful Podcast, Luc Hibert, on the show to talk about the show itself and when it's going to start. Once again, I'd like to thank everybody for making this show possible and listening to the show and providing your feedback. We're going to have Season 3 starting in the fall of 2023. So please send us your suggested topics because we want to provide evidence-based information to help you, veterans, clinicians, researchers, anybody struggling with pain. So send your suggestions in. You can contact us on Facebook and Twitter at Chronic Pain, COE, and on Instagram at chronic_pain_COE. Thanks for your support, and now we'll carry on with the show. As we said in many shows, the research shows that veterans suffer from chronic pain twice that of the general population. We had on Season 1 some researchers talking about the use of cannabis and the effectiveness it has on chronic pain. Today we're going to talk to Dr. Rob Whitley, who's a professor at McGill University, and he's going to talk about the impact media has on veterans who suffer with chronic pain. He's conducted a 3-year research project looking at veterans in the media who struggle with operational stress injury, and also done 3 documentaries on cannabis and pain. Rob, welcome to the show.
Hello, Tom. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Maybe you can just give us a bit of background on exactly what your research is exploring on cannabis and just that connection to veterans and pain.
Yeah, so I think to contextualize this, I should really talk about the research I've been doing on the media and how veterans are perceived in the media. So since 2020, so almost 3 years ago, I've been doing a study where on a day-by-day basis, we are obtaining media articles that talk about veterans in any way, shape or form. And we are then coding them to look at the content and the themes which are appearing in these articles. And in year 1 of the study, from 2020 to 2021, we got about 900 articles. And in year 2 of the study, 2021 to 22, we also got about 900 articles. And one of the key findings from this study is that very few articles talk about chronic pain. So we're looking at mainstream media such as Globe and Mail, the National Post, Global News, CTV, CBC. We're looking at local newspapers, Montreal Gazette, Vancouver Sun. So we've got a wide range of media in this study, including French language media as well. And like I said, only about 1 in 10 articles are looking at factors such as kind of chronic pain. And we find that there are also very few articles talking about treatments for chronic pain or for any other physical mental health issues, that there are very few articles talking about recovery. There are very few articles talking about rehabilitation or rehabilitative technologies. And we're finding that a lot of the media coverage either occurs on or around November the 11th or Remembrance Day, focused on the activities then. And the rest, a lot of the other coverage focuses on anomalous outliers, such as Lionel Desmond and the Lionel Desmond story that we're all familiar with. As a consequence of this, we obtained a research grant from the Mental Health Commission of Canada, where we have recently produced 3 documentary videos about medical cannabis and how this can be used into management of chronic pain. And we felt this was very important because this was rarely talked about in the mainstream media, even though we know that many people with chronic pain are using medical cannabis. Medical cannabis was legalized in Canada, one of the few jurisdictions in the world to do this a few years ago. And therefore, there's a need for more education for the general public, for clinicians, for family members, and for others. So we recently produced and released 3 videos on medical cannabis, one of which really focuses on the veteran experience. We had a great response when we were trying to organize these documentaries. We had veterans from British Columbia to Newfoundland contacting us. We were able to interview many of these veterans. They appear in our short video, and they're talking about how medical cannabis can be really useful in the management of chronic pain, can be useful in helping people in terms of veterans who have sleep issues, can be useful in terms of issues such as anxiety and PTSD. People have to leave and go out into the world. That could be useful in managing the stress that can incur. So the media coverage research that I've been doing and the medical cannabis kind of documentary research that we've been doing really overlaps quite considerably and kind of enmesh together in that way.
Yeah, because we look at, it's interesting to hear that there's not much discussion on chronic pain yet. The research shows, veterans suffer from chronic pain twice out of the Canadian population. We know from the Canadian Pain Society that many people struggle with chronic pain. I mean, that's one of the reasons we did this podcast is to try to bring that information out to people. So one would expect that we would have seen more of that in the media. But having said that, we look at medical cannabis. I know in our season one, we had, research say that it does help some people and it doesn't, it may or may not help people depending, but also that there's not a lot of information about medical cannabis use in the veterans community and like proper dosing and that. Did you find that in your research as well?
Yeah, so I mean, cannabis is a plant and it's really an umbrella term in a way. Cannabis has 2 main active ingredients, THC, CBD, and many people are not aware that there are different strains of cannabis which have different ratios of CBD to THC. The different strains can have different physiological effects. This has been under research, so even physiologists, medical doctors are not perfectly aware of what effect each strand has on each biological, physiological system. So there's definitely a big need for education for every stakeholder in society regarding medical cannabis, for doctors, for physicians, for veterans, for family members, for stakeholders, Veterans Affairs Canada, etc. So the knowledge base is not as well developed as it might be for other medical interventions such as opioids, for example, where there's been decades of research. It's obviously difficult to do research on what was an illegal drug until relatively recently. So that's one of the contributing factors to a bit of the lack of knowledge. So in terms of knowledge, one thing that when there's a lack of kind of physiological knowledge or randomized control trials, one form of knowledge that becomes more important is experiential knowledge. And in this study we did for the videos about medical cannabis, we spent a lot of time listening to veterans. We interviewed dozens across the country, and we asked some neutral, unloaded questions. Tell us about the impact cannabis has on your life. How does it affect you? How often do you take it? And our aim was really to get at the truth. It wasn't to be a kind of pro-cannabis video or anti-cannabis video. But we did universally hear veterans telling us that it had a very positive effect on their well-being. It gave them a sense of equilibrium. It helped them in their sleep cycle. It helped them go out into the world where they were otherwise somewhat anxious. We heard many veterans tell us, for example, that they used to take opioids, but opioids turned them into kind of couch potatoes or zombies, or turned their personality in a way which the veterans themselves didn't particularly appreciate. So they tried kind of medical cannabis instead and found that was a better option. Obviously, I'm not here to promulgate one or the other or to give medical advice. I'm just reporting what we heard in our research study. And we did hear many veterans saying that the use of cannabis for medical purposes was helpful for their chronic pain, both in terms of chronic mental pain and chronic physical pain.
So when you're talking about like what was the study size and how many veterans did you talk to, and was there differences in response, or was it overwhelming one result over another?
Yeah, so there's a few. The study was a preliminary study, and we can't extrapolate too much. So in total, we interviewed about 40 people. That includes veterans, some experts, and also some non-veterans who use cannabis. The study was advertised in different veteran Facebook groups and on different veteran email lists. And it may be that the veterans who use cannabis, who had a positive effect, were more likely to come and talk to us than those who used it once and it had kind of no effect. So in terms of the great scheme of science, this is quite a modest kind of preliminary study. But I think the important thing about this study is it does converge with many other recent studies which have emerged since the legalization of cannabis and in the veteran space and the non-veteran space, showing that many veterans and many other non-veterans with chronic pain are using medical cannabis. They're reporting subjectively that this is having a positive effect. They're often comparing it to their experience previously on opioids and other medication and saying that this is an option which is really helping them. And it's also consistent with other findings in medicine recently about things such as yoga or prayer or mindfulness meditation being useful for chronic pain. These are all, in a sense, kind of non-conventional, non-mainstream treatments that haven't gone through the whole factory of scientific experimentation and hasn't gone through every stage of intervention development, which on paper we like interventions to go through. But we're hearing a lot of experiential knowledge from people on the ground that this has been helpful. And this is something we have to take seriously.
So when you talk about documentaries, you said there were 3 series. So what was the focus of the documentary? I mean, obviously to see if cannabis is effective or is helping people and it's anecdotal. And what was the other end of it, or the other two series?
Yeah, so it was a trilogy, and the first part of the trilogy was really looking at the origins of the stigma of cannabis use. And it actually comes a lot from the United States and from racial politics and fears about immigration, that cannabis use was used by people from the Caribbean and from Mexico and South America. And this was not what good upstanding WASP types in America should be using. So the first documentary looks a bit at the history of stigma and where it came from and how it developed over time of cannabis use. And then the second documentary zeroes in a bit on cannabis and mental health, why people with mental health issues might be using cannabis for factors such as kind of social anxiety, for factors such as sleep issues, factors such as chronic pain. And then the third video really focuses on so there's veterans in all the videos, but the third video really zeroes in on the veteran experience, where we interview only veterans and we talk about the kind of issues that veterans face, both chronic pain, post-traumatic stress disorder, reintegration after transition from military to civilian life, and how medical cannabis has helped people with many of these issues.
When you're doing the research in that, was there any comparison against non-veterans? I mean, I would suspect that someone struggling with pain, veteran or not, may have some similar experiences using cannabis, or was any of that looked at?
Well, we certainly did compare the experience between veterans and non-veterans. And I think the one variable that came up frequently for veterans, obviously, but kind of importantly, is Veterans Affairs Canada, and the fact that Veterans Affairs Canada will reimburse a certain amount of medical cannabis usage as a medication. And on the one hand, many people said that they're very grateful for this, that this is a useful change in the approach of Veterans Affairs Canada. On the other hand, there were people who said, well, the actual dosage and the amount that it reimburses is not really commensurate with the daily usage that people have, for the amount of issues that they have, including chronic pain, PTSD, etc. That was a kind of common theme that came up amongst the veterans as compared to the non-veterans. Another factor that came up was some of the chronic pain issues amongst veterans, typically much more severe than one would see in the civilian world. So one of the people we interviewed was an amputee, had one of his limbs amputated. Others showed us, some very, very big scars during the interview process that they incurred in Afghanistan and other places. The anxiety that many of the veterans expressed going to, so one of the veterans said he got highly anxious going to West Edmonton Mall, which was where he lived nearby, because being around crowds and after his experience in Afghanistan was very difficult, but medical cannabis allowed him to kind of manage this. So we did see similar issues in the veterans, non-veterans, but I think more focused and more acute in some ways amongst the veterans, given the nature of their experience.
And I think too, like there's been articles in the mainstream media about the amount Veterans Affairs covers for cannabis and that, but then we've also had researchers and veterans themselves who are involved in it saying that the dosing isn't well known. What's the proper dosing, and sometimes more is dispensed than is actually needed, and so there seems to be from what I understand, there seems to be a lot of confusion on what is the right amount and when to use it and use it for and how to use it for pain and psychological concerns.
Yeah, and that by their own admission, we for our project we interviewed I think about 10 to 12 experts, including doctors, professors, medical professionals, and they said the same. They said there are no you can get like CANMAT guidelines. They like clinic you can get clinical guidelines for antidepressants, for antipsychotics, for lithium, for bipolar other medication for bipolar disorder, and it's all available on the internet, and you learn it at medical school. But in terms of cannabis, there are no guidelines. There's not a lot of training for anyone out there, and like I said earlier, we're not even sure of which strains are useful for which kind of physiological conditions.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a bit of trial and error in terms of individuals and also clinicians working with clients who are coming for medical cannabis. One of the downsides of this, one of the many downsides, is that we did hear in our study that some doctors are refusing to prescribe it because it's not necessarily out of stigma that might be a factor, but it's partly because they don't feel equipped to give the right dosage and they don't want to make any errors. And the medical ethic of do no harm overrides taking a risk for some of these doctors. So we've had a few people in our study that lived quite in rural, remote areas, and they said they only have one physician in their local town, and that person refuses to prescribe medical cannabis. So I remember one person in our study telling us that he would have to drive like 6 hours to his local big town to see a doctor who would prescribe medical cannabis because of his issues. He couldn't do it he had to stay overnight because he needed to sleep afterwards, and needed to go book into a hotel and then drive back to his home the next morning. And these are huge barriers to healthcare. I mean, how can this is just not really justice, is it, to expect people to do that to obtain a drug through a medical prescription?
Yeah, and that's interesting because when I know you and I talked back in Montreal when you gave your presentation, and you know, one would think that, oh, okay, what about the topic of cannabis in the media with veterans? Why is that so important? But when I hear you talk, it is important because it builds a perception, not just for the veteran, but for the public and also for the medical practitioners. And then what we're hearing is there needs to be more research, but also more guidelines so that it's more accessible, from what you're saying.
Yeah, and more education as well. So from what the experts told me, and I have no reason to disbelieve them, that a young Canadian student can go to medical school, do his or her 5 years, and will not receive one instruction at all about medical cannabis. And the same would go for occupational therapists and psychologists and social workers. So everybody's kind of groping around in the dark. You can look on Google and other places, and there's not, like I said, guidelines which are standardized or tested. So it's tough, and one has to be sympathetic to the doctors and the medical practitioners because they're typically loath to give out anything where there hasn't been controlled research and where they could be worried about potential side effects. And we do know, especially amongst people under 25, that there is a side effect of cannabis use, which is an increased risk of psychosis. Problem is that piece of information has become much more well known than the piece of information that I'm conveying here, which is that medical cannabis can also be very useful as a painkiller to help people control other symptoms of PTSD and chronic pain, and that many drugs can have a potentially negative side effect and a potentially very positive main effect. And it's up for like clinicians and patients to negotiate that and to think about the risks. But if you look at the media coverage and you look at the discourse in the universities and the clinics, that focus on psychosis and cannabis has become much more profound and deeper than anything else. Even though that psychosis cannabis link, it is a real link, but it's really focused on under 25s, and the veteran community is typically a fair bit older than 25. So it's the developing brain that we have to worry about in terms of cannabis use, and once it's more or less developed, there's much less of a risk of psychosis.
But in your work, did you see that there was quite a bit of research on the medical benefits of cannabis, or is it still lagging?
The problem is that medical cannabis is it is an industry and it is growing slowly, and it does exist in British Columbia and other places. But in comparison to the pharmaceutical industry, it dwarfs into comparison. It's almost negligible compared to the huge multinationals that we know about, like Eli Lilly and Moderna, and these companies that are making medications that day and night for decades. And these companies obviously sponsor a lot of research into their medications, and many psychiatry departments and these pathology departments across Canada are receiving multi-million-dollar grants from these companies to test their drugs. And there's no equivalent impetus for medical cannabis research. So medical cannabis research dwarfs in comparison to research for drugs coming from these major companies. And obviously then it's easy for people to say, well, take these drugs, they've been very well researched, and these drugs haven't been well researched, so these are kind of dangerous. And it is important to say, which is a bit controversial, but I feel it is important, that people have written that these big drug companies have a bit of an undue influence on research and psychiatry departments, that they give money, they do a lot of testing and a lot of trials. Some of them don't see the light of day if they're not finding positive results for the company and for their drugs, and others that do show positive results are really trumpeted to the high heavens. So there's a structural factor in the lack of research about medical cannabis as well.
So important issue, and of course the perception of how medical cannabis is viewed in the public is an important component. So I'd like to thank you today for taking the time to talk to us about that, Rob. Important work that you're doing. And maybe we'll have you back to talk about the other research that you're doing on veterans in the media with operational stress injury. So thanks for being on the show, Dr. Rob Whitley.
Thanks a lot, Tom. It was a great pleasure.
Thank you. And for our audience, if you have any feedback about the show or you want more information on chronic pain, you can visit our website, veteranschronicpain.ca, or follow us on Facebook and Twitter at Chronic Pain COE, and on Instagram at chronicpain_COE. So keep following us. Lots of good information. We've got a lot of good feedback, and we're going to have more guests coming in the new year. And once again, Rob, thank you. And for our audience, stay safe and keep the hope alive.
The Most Painful Podcast is produced for the Chronic Pain Center of Excellence by Story Studio Network and Eye Contact Productions.